Welcome to Contemplify, where we seek to kindle the examined life for contemplatives in the world. I'm your host, Paul Swanson. Today, I welcome Reverend Dr. Cynthia Bourgeault, a mystic, a teacher, a writer, Episcopal priest. In our conversation, we talk about her book, Thomas Keating, The Making of a Modern Mystic. A book that should not have, but did, surprise me with Keating's brilliance and Cynthia's interpretation in understanding the route that Thomas Keating took on and off well-worn mystical maps. Bravo for that. And Cynthia has had an outsized impact on my life over the years. Yes, in her books, but in a word here or there that opened a new direction or portal of insight. It's enough warm-up. Let's move into the conversation. So, as always, you can visit contemplify.com for the show notes on this episode and head over to cynthiabourgeault.org to learn more about Cynthia. Again, that's cynthiabourgeault.org. Now join me in raising a glass to my guest and friend today, Cynthia Bourgeault. The place to begin, Cynthia. Where am I finding you today? What is the context of your setting? What location are you in right now?
Well, I am right now in Rockland, Maine, which is a little seacoast town in the great state of Maine, about halfway up the coast. And I have a little bit of a big house, retreat center, studio thing that I have, and I'm going to have here where we have about 27 wisdom students who are going to come and do Holy Week together.
That's marvelous. I hope some of my pals are in that mix. For folks who don't know who you are, if someone were going to take a class where it's on the formation of Cynthia Bourgeault, what would you say would be the 3 mandatory readings or works that formed you that would definitely be on that syllabus?
That formed me,
That formed you.
Well, that's an interesting question. One of them would be the Bible, clearly. And along with that, the Rule of St. Benedict, which really comments on it and interprets it in beautiful ways. The various George Gurdjieff books, particularly In Search of the Miraculous, knocked my life in a radically different direction. Thomas Kelly, the contemporary Quaker mystic, A Testament of Devotion. And I think most of the canon of Jacob Burba, that 17th century German shoemaker mystic, who I actually was given to read at Holy Week many, many moons ago when I was out at the monastery at St. Benedict's. And it was like he leaped off the page and sort of took me on as a student across the centuries and sort of taught me, and it impressed on me much of what I know. So those would be the books, if you think that you really learn who somebody is or what they come to by way of books. I would say that equally on that bibliography would be sailing, floating in the ocean, doing hand work, trying to live in a fishing island for many years in survivalist mode. It's these things that are not on the page that actually shape you a lot more than the things that are on the page.
Cynthia, I couldn't agree more about there is the book learning, there is the things that we take in through text, which is significant in certain ways, but then also there is the ways that the wordless, the landscape, the environment, art, song influence us. And you just mentioned sailing and your hand and your work on a fishing island. What has the landscape and place taught you in ways that nothing else could teach you? Are you able to articulate how you've been shaped by the places that you've been? I not only think about your time living near the monastery there in Colorado, but also your hermitage on an island. How have these landscapes been containers or cells of transformation for you?
Well, I think there's 3 particular landscapes that have been really important. what is the landscape of the ocean, which has been important to me ever since I was a kid at 2 or 3, and has taught me all of my basic lessons in life, like how to float, how to swim, just the wild, pitiless intimacy of something so cosmic and interconnected. I remember reading at one point some beautiful child's book that says, all land is one land under the sea. And when you're in the sea, you really know the truth of that. So the sea has been a part of my life. I scratch my head and say that most of my life I've actually lived on islands. So I want to be not only around and near the ocean, but in it and of it. And I guess that was a natural compulsion. The other landscape, the second landscape that I would say is really important, is the holy landscape, as lived particularly in monasteries, contemplative monasteries. St. Benedict's Monastery, New Camaldoli Hermitage, the great beautiful Trappist Camaldolese monastery overlooking the Pacific Ocean near Big Sur. These holes to me. And a beautiful little Benedictine monastery just on the south side of Boston called Glastonbury Abbey, which has 9 Benedictine monks who are so filled with joy and hospitality and whose liturgy is so beautiful that this is like what I call a vocation or a vacation to World 12, to the heart of Christ, where everything is lived with a different kind of order and intensity. So the monastic landscapes have been totally important, totally formatory. And balancing that has been the real need and an intention to work in landscapes that are hands-on. The third thing that's been really important has been the need to work in communities where people are still living primarily by their hands, and where hands are important in salvation. I mean, that you learn that milk doesn't come from a store, milk comes from a cow. And I felt very, very strongly that one of the things that's caused us to get more and more out in la-la land as a culture is that we've lost a direct connection to our environment and what Gurdjieff calls the cost of our arising. It's dark, you switch on a light. It's cold, you switch on the heat. And we don't understand viscerally anymore what it means to be cold. We don't understand what it means for our body to understand things before our mind does. So we live in these little bubbles that disconnect us from reality. I've spent a lot of my time ever since the 70s as a sort of back to the lander by instinct, not because I'm particularly good at that task, but because I just love the overall balance and feeling of having to be completely in touch with your own physical cost and implications of existence.
Yeah, well, I think it's a prophetic word in a time when the digital lives of so many, even the fact that we have that phrase, digital life, separated from the day-to-day reality of the land that we touch, the food that we eat, the work that we do with our hands. It seems to be only intensifying. And I also feel like we're only beginning to see the cost of that, what we're losing in that. And that's been, in small ways, the fun of, like, with my kids, of just having chickens, of composting, of working a garden, of showing them how all these things come together and how they participate in this as well. That it's just not all, doesn't come to us seal wrapped from a grocery store. That's not his origin story. But the day-to-dayness of that. And I think too, like, what is the mastery of craft? When you see a skilled laborer, I learn a lot more about the craft of contemplation by watching a friend who's a master welder work and what it takes to do that type of work. And how is that not separate from the spiritual / contemplative work?
That is so beautiful. And I would add that too, that I remember a wonderful old Maine lobster fisherman who was telling this tech expert from the Department of Fisheries how to do something. And the old lobsterman says, "It's not like it looks when you read it in the books." There's a direct carryover from what Gurdjieff calls the moving center, the intelligence that's properly learned in the hands. And this carries right over into the contemplative life. That one of the things is that people just don't get self-oblation till they've done a full self-prostration on the floor, straight out, flat out. Otherwise, surrender, self-oblation, when you tangle with it in the middle center, you don't quite get some element that only the body knows. I've found that this model that's called three-centered awareness is crucial to the maintenance of what I call an honest contemplation, not just a recorded, not an airy-fairy contemplation or a wish fulfillment or look at me being a contemplative. I would love to have the word contemplative lifestyle completely excised from the spiritual vocabulary, because contemplation is not a lifestyle. It's a face-to-face, ongoing, direct relationship with the infinite. And until you really get the cost of that and the nature and the intensity of that, the contemplative lifestyle is what Thomas Merton once described as making itsy-bitsy little statues.
Yeah. Especially, that language is so ripe in our culture right now of like lifestyle gurus of it. It's all the appearance, the cosmetic of the outside, and there's no dirt under the fingernails of the work itself. And I think to transition to your amazing new book on Thomas Keating, The Making of a Modern Christian Mystic, I think this book is joining the canon of classics, because not only, I don't think anyone else could have written this book, but you're pointing to what we're talking about here about the radicality of what happens in the unfolding journey of the contemplative into deeper waters. And what I love about, to kind of skip over some pieces of the book, but going over how Thomas, as a Trappist, bolted to the depths of contemplative practice and centering prayer, popularized it, was in conversation around non-duality with vibrant interspiritual friendships and dialogue. And that would be enough. A fascinating portrait and what can we learn from his journey as a map. But then you take on what you call the late Thomas years and the breakthroughs that take readers off what we think of the usual kind of Christian maps. And I found this work to be the most exciting thing that I've read in this field in ages. And I hope we'll tackle as much of this as we can in a short amount of time. But I hope it's for all those listening, this is a foretaste of the banquet that awaits in this book. So one, just to kind of set the container of your own relationship with Thomas, I've heard you say you went from a student-teacher relationship to kind of spiritual colleagues and kind of landed as friends and peers in that. Can you speak about that kind of creative evolution and tensions that ultimately brought you to this landing space of friendship?
Well, let me see if I can speak of it in a way that just doesn't sort of disgorge my whole life story with all its uncooked seeds and things. But I had a real strong start with Thomas when I first came out to Snowmass in 1990 to do my first centering prayer intensive, followed very, very quickly with what was then called formation training or presenter training, where you learn to actually do the 6-hour introductory workshop, and they passed or failed you on whether you could get through teaching people for 6 hours about centering prayer. So that was not a huge deal to me. I've been teaching in academic settings for more than a decade at that point. So I knew how to teach, and I was an Episcopal priest, so I knew how to do the gift of gab from the pulpit. So it was easy. I sort of had a good, swift start in the contemplative outreach thing, but then we hit into troubled water that I'll just sort of describe generally as collective false selves in various stages of sort of exposing themselves and disrobing and jostling up against each other sort of created a lot of harm, a lot of hurt. There was a couple of really definitely bad actors in the midst. And so everything sort of fell apart. And I realized at one point the only thing I could do was to sort of get the hell out of Dodge, that I was being maneuvered so that I would be basically not allowed to exercise not only my contemplative outreach standing, but also my priesthood in any of the recognizable dioceses of the Episcopal Church. I said, this is just too crazy. So I went to British Columbia for a while on a very, very kind, wonderful invitation from a group of people there that wanted to form a contemplative teaching and living unit, that wanted more practice, more teaching, more hands-on. And what they were doing that was so intriguing to me was they were quite determined to put contemplative centering prayer and Christian meditation together as a basis. And at this point, both of those organizations, who were delivering sister but very different practices in centering prayer, were deeply into the weeds of building their own little delivery structures. And they were sort of rivalries against each other. You couldn't be in one group if you practiced centering prayer, or you couldn't be in this group if you practiced Christian meditation. So this group wanted to put them together and really get back to the Christian tradition. And that was such a liberating thing that it really gave me my start with a little bit of space away from Colorado, away from St. Benedict's Monastery, away from the heavy hitters that were emerging in contemplative outreach at the time, and Thomas's own dark night journey, as well as my own. So, wonderful time in British Columbia that changed our relationship. And I never even expected this was going to happen. But by the time I got back, I realized that Thomas Keating and I had this deal that I was never going to go anywhere within the official power structure of contemplative outreach. And he was never going to give me anything in an official sort of entitled way. And on the other hand, we were by that completely free. I didn't have to paste father agendas on him, needy agendas. Can't you help me, Thomas? Can't you? It just done. So we would just see each other and we just talk. And particularly as Thomas got older and entered what I call late Thomas, where he was just off the charts of the known universe of Christianity, it was like this extraordinary freedom to just listen to each other, understand each other, respect what was going on with absolutely no strings attached. It was a kind of unconditional presence. And I don't know how we got there except by sheer grace. There was no drama. There was never any confession of any wrongs we'd done to each other if we'd had. It was more, what wrongs had happened had just been unconscious human beings bumping into each other. But it was just done. It was clean. It was empty. There was no strings. And so I got in a beautiful way to be the witness to Thomas. And I could also kind of keep pace with him. Not so much, I'm not in any sense claiming kind of equal spiritual understanding, which was absurd. He was out there. But because of my background with the Gurdjieff work and some of the work with consciousness, some of the work with my monastic teacher and friend Rafe at St. Benedict's, who was also covering these same bases like 20 years before Thomas, I could follow what Thomas was doing and kind of respond. He'd pitch me a ball and I could pitch it back. And so there was this kind of wonderful liberation as he explored. And I think he took not only himself, but the whole Christian spiritual tradition way beyond what's ever been known or stated about the genuine non-dual in Christianity before. I was watching him write the canon before my very eyes, and it made my jaw drop.
Well, that's a stunning distillation of that journey. And I think the fact that you had that front row seat and that you were able to articulate, because I think that there's the ability to bear witness and watch and absorb, but then also to try to articulate it to others so that they can kind of see how far Thomas went beyond what the usual kind of maps that we were given. The ability to receive and then to kind of transmit this in the work of this book, I was just kind of blown away by this work of late Thomas. Like, I knew about the popularizing of centering prayer and the snow mass dialogues with interspiritual friends, and his ability to hold curiosity and interest in multiple lanes and kind of distill it and speak to it depending on at varying levels based on those that he was presenting it to. And then you sketched this period that you dubbed the late Thomas, and reading it was just thrilling. Like, it felt like watching an artist in their studio for how you were trying to artfully systematize the unsystematizable. How challenging was that for you to try to put this in a book form to be able to articulate so folks could see, hey, there's a further journey. There's this unfolding map beyond what we've cherished in the Christian tradition, but that there's more potentially in waiting.
Well, in a way, the most honest answer, Paul, is that it wasn't challenging at all. It was a piece of cake, but that's because of the larger context. I think, and this comes close to the traditional sort of predestination talk, but there was a certain there was a certain objectivity or impartiality in the relationship between Thomas and me. And it was almost like, I keep coming back to that kind of funny story from the Sufi tradition of Shim's, Tabriz, and Rumi. And Shim's this extraordinary diamond of a brilliantly evolved spiritual teacher, but wanting and needing somebody who could kind of take it and synthesize it and distill it and put it in another way. And so there was a sort of almost inevitability in their colliding. And I think hopefully all humility, something of that happened to Thomas and me. And it's what carried us through a lot of those thick kind of thorny patches in our relationship. There was never any doubt but that we had to work it out because we were in some sense on a trajectory to work together. And so I think Thomas very early picked up that I had this kind of unusual quality in the mind that, just like him, liked to have ideas thrown together and loved to synthesize. He picked up the training, and I really felt his hand at my back, but very annoyingly, the way it always was when Thomas got something. No difference in life and beyond life, but it was like, Cynthia, when are you going to get this book done? Cynthia, when are you going to? But the way opened, and in the same light that I was writing about it, he allowed me to see it and make sense of it, and it made sense of things in my own life. I realized finally that I did have one kind of ace up my sleeve that had come from these years and years and years of working at Swarthmore College, teaching kids in introductory college English how to read and think and write by analyzing poems. And when the last work that Thomas gave us was a collection of 8 poems, The Secret Embrace, I said, I can do this. I know how to dive into a poem, listen it into life, find out what it's saying. I know all these things. Like the repertory was not alien to me. And I said, okay, I can do this. And because I could see how his deep teaching was embedded in these poems and could stay with it, I took the risk of really sort of thinking that, the reason that people are not rushing right out to embrace late Thomas is because they just don't really understand how to begin to access it. It's not only off the charts in terms of where Christian classic teaching has been, it's off the charts in terms of the skills that people have been taught in their educational formation. So I said, okay, I can do this. And it's the little piece that I could give back to serve the extraordinary amount that was given to me By Thomas, certainly personally, by the monks of St. Benedict's Monastery who put up with me, humored me, fed me, forgave me, as I was just diving into the same waters that Thomas and all of them dived into to understand what happens when you get to the end of the road of your love affair with yourself. What's the territory like out beyond it? So it was a sort of opportunity to sort of pay off something of the debt of my arising and give back something. And the way opened seamlessly. I didn't do it out of my own head.
Wow. It's so exquisite to read that portion of the book and the way that the secret embrace, there's so much held inside of it. And then how that comes from Thomas's own experiences, but also what he's trying to communicate. And as you say, what happens at the end of the road when the love affair with yourself ends.
So I just wanted to continue that thought a little bit with that line from one of Thomas's poems: when there is no more me, myself, or mine, only I am remains, then the I may drop away, leaving just the am. Now, in something like 10 words, this is the most stunning, groundbreaking foray into the life beyond story, life beyond self-reflexive consciousness. It's like, how did he just do that? That's late Thomas, and that pushes the whole playing field forward of what Christians have ever dared to hope or theme or imagine. You split up the Yah, they, and let Yah go, and there's only they, the unconditional, uncreated, undualistic, from the get-go divine. Is this? And then in the next minute, Thomas comes back and says, well, if this is divine, is this? Maybe we should just call him Izzy. You watch Thomas and everything he's doing in the last years of his life, doing these incredible leaps from the absolute way out, inaccessible, non-dual, right in the cosmogonic heart, right into the, well, let's just call him Izzy, affirming the personal, affirming our own little lives, affirming the way we play, and saying that there's a direct line of connection between these. And this is possible, and this is wonderful. And you watch him enacting this and the extraordinary joy that just falls off him in the last years of his life. And I don't mean like by that he was happy all the time. He mostly spent the last interviews complaining. If there was a script for our last interviews, it always began with me saying, well, how are you, Thomas? And he says, well, I'm dying. And then he went on to all his complaints, right down to they didn't do his egg right. And then the next part of the agenda was his introducing me to all the people that he thought was going to be his next hotshot spiritual son. He really, 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 really wanted a son to carry on the legacy. So he'd tell me, we went through Locke Kelly, we went through, all sorts of people that Thomas was just totally invested in. When that was done, then we got into it, and we just sort of played, and there was this wide-ranging. And you saw that, so he was often in deep physical pain, but the joy was like almost a sublime, supernatural physical force, subtle physical force that had gathered in it. And some people, like your old boss at CIC, Kirsten, went into the room with him at one conference just to say hi. And she and Bree Stoner and some of the others were just wiped out by the power of blessing that hit them like a tsunami. He was just having a normal day fretting about his egg. But that was what had become of him. And it was the stunning amount of the cognitive dissonance, or if you want to call it the cosmic resonance between the sublime and the absurd. was a point of his life which he shared, and we just had wonderful belly laughs about it.
The sublime and the absurd. I feel like those pair so well together. And the example you talk about too, like the language that it seemed like Thomas sort of used was unmanifest, and yet
Yeah.
also is he. And you talk about this being like fusion non-duality. Like he was bringing something, naming something, bringing something forth that can rightly be called Christian non-duality, even though it might freak out the nominal Christian. Can you speak more to the fusion non-duality piece?
Yeah, it might freak out the Christian evolutionist as well, because, and in a certain way, in those kind of comments, Thomas broke free even from Ken Wilber, who was his sort of closest mentor and guide through the years, because Christianity seems absolutely determined to look at spiritual evolution as structures and stages. And stages are, you transcend and you include, you go from one to another. And that's the normal sort of, I would call, semi-mature understanding of it. And at the end, Thomas came to see just what Jean Gebser and some of the others was that there is no sequence. It's not a ladder of progress. These things all live in each other with a sort of random counter infusion. And what he was saying, because in some of these evolutionary maps, the personal is an immature stage. And if you believe in a personal God, you're less mature than if you believe in a great transpersonal isness. Thomas said, no way. And he said this in his being. And that's what the I drops away and there's only the am. But then in the next moment in that poem, he's back giving a little kind of lecture about God empowers our powerlessness so we never lose hope, that you could hear in any pulpit on Maundy Thursday. And he's like, let's get over it, people. There are no levels. And Thomas Merton had exactly that same breakthrough just before he took off on his last trip. He says, you discover that there is no higher or lower. The higher is the lower. At any moment, you can break through to the reality that is God and Jesus Christ. In the end, oneness, prayer, praise, gives thanks, oneness is all. And it's a kind of oneness that doesn't disregard levels. It doesn't turn it all into a monochrome beige. But it's like the levels aren't standing on each other's back competing with each other. That God flows into the lesser as much as we flow into the greater. And the whole thing is God, not just the upward journey. So in that way, he turned evolution on its head and brought it squarely back to its roots in involution. And what's interesting is that on the evolutionary roadmaps, involution is sort of a naughty word because it means that you go from higher form to a lesser, from a higher state to a lower. You're devolving. But, what did Jesus do if not involve? Though his state was that of God, yet he did not deem equality with God something he should cling to. Rather, he emptied himself. And to equate the basic incarnational motion with involution, with the willing taking on of the less, not just as social action, but in consciousness and in capability, is to claim both directions. And I think that was the joy that Thomas was seeing at the end of his life, that it wasn't just this long march up the hill where Sisyphus with the boulder to the great final transpersonal, that just when you just about had that boulder up there, you met this tsunami of God coming back, searching into form, because it's here in our stupid little life with Izzy that something is generated that can't say itself in that vast cosmic isness. And I think Thomas says in one of his poems, and those that know this are overcome with a laughter too deep to be heard. So I think that that's his breakthrough. And it's just extraordinary.
It is so extraordinary. And what I so appreciate about it as well is it kind of fulfills all his previous work too. Like centering prayer, the kenosis and presence are staples. They're bedrock for companions along his entire journey that don't diminish as he brings in experiences unity consciousness. Can you speak to just kenosis and presence? Because these are phrases that I feel like, especially those in centering prayer circles, are very used to hearing Thomas talk about, and how they interact with practice, but they also, it's not an end in itself. It's a part of that evolution and that involution that you were just speaking of.
Well, let me talk about that really concretely so we don't get into a definition game. One of the conditions that Thomas had to work with all his life, his false self-struggle, was his entitlement. He was a tall, white guy, a male, privileged, grew up with an elite education, with prominent parents and relatives who could move him along, help him in the pipeline wherever it was needed. So he recognized in himself, little by little, and I think he was still working on this toward the very end of his life, that he was going to so unconsciously gravitate to identifying with viewing the world through privileged eyeballs that he couldn't see what was actually happening. And what happened in the last 6 months of his life was that he began to experience more and more powerfully powerlessness, and it was intense suffering. And little by little, something began to change in him. And by the time he had reached even 4 years before the end of his life in 2014, powerlessness had become literally his daily bread. He speaks about this in one of the poems in that last collection. But he doesn't mean that like, this is the penance I had to do. Powerless was literally his sacramental bread, because he realized that powerlessness was his meeting place with Christ. Because what could be more powerless than Christ on the cross? In accepting his own, he realized that powerlessness was actually the holy sacrament that connected you to everything. And it's way, way easy to do this on lip service, so we identify with the poor but to actually get that in your body, that you seek powerlessness as holy. And he came to that at the end of a long journey, and a long and honest journey of catching himself out, when he realized that he was using his implicit assumption of, that he would have only to snap your fingers and 30,000 angels are there. And he never pushed that down your face. He wasn't an Enneagram 8. But he knew it. You could see him working out of it. But at the end, he changed. So the process that got him there was really this deep kenosis. And kenosis, as I've talked about, it means self-emptying. And the word, of course, comes from the Greek word kenosin, which is what you have in that wonderful counsel from Paul about putting on the mind of Christ. Though his state was that of God, I've quoted already, he did not deem equality with God something he should cling to, but he emptied himself. That's kenosis. He let go. He willingly and consciously and warm-heartedly deferred in order to make space for something else to be. And Thomas began to understand more and more incrementally over the last 30 years of his life. The kenosis, letting go, was the key to the whole thing. And I think in the beginning, even when he was developing the method of centering prayer, he didn't have this absolutely firmly centered. He still was using some of the meditation typologies he'd gotten from the East about how you empty your mind, you watch your consciousness, but he hadn't directly connected it with the heart of Christianity. And he kept saying, he kept getting hung up on, when is it okay to let go of a thought? When is it okay? And finally, he realized that the practice was not about still mind. It was about an active practice of kenosis by the willingness to let go of a thought when you were caught. And it was nothing but this repeated practice in that. But if Paul is correct that it's kenosis that really puts on the mind of Christ, not clear mind. He'd finally made his connection. And he was with increasing steadiness, particularly in the last 10 years of his life, when he was really mostly housebound at the monastery. He learned to default to the path of kenosis as the first option, because he knew it was the quick road, it was the royal road to the kind of Christian non-dual grace that he was beginning to smell and sense.
I'm so struck by that kenosis, that sense of the willingness being the action in the practice. I think this is part of the fruits of his inner spiritual dialogues, is getting a lot of this wisdom from other traditions, and yet having to wrestle with, like, how is this missing the heart of what is the Christian tradition? And once that clicked in, it sounded like he was then also able to look at the maps and say, like, this no longer, like, what is this dark night of the self? Like, to ask a wondering question, because it was a dangerous question. But it was the willingness to let go of what was, and what the trustworthy maps, how they were holding, and how there was a limitation to what he would, in those maps, that could not explain where he was headed and what he was experiencing.
Yeah. And I think there's a similarity with Thomas Merton as well here. That certainly Thomas Merton was a great leader in interspiritual monastic dialogue, and in the realization that the other traditions, who had very, very developed non-dual traditions, were probably going to have a lot of light to shed on Christianity's own non-dual inclinations, much more so than the classic spiritual treatises of Christianity. But by the same time, both men were so deeply formed in their own Christian heart that it wasn't a matter of any sort of syncretistic borrowing or kind of completing the map. It was a deep recognition, like when somebody finally gives you words for something you've known all along, anyway. And that was the reason that Thomas Keating and Thomas Merton were both able to write with such deep conviction and open-heartedness about the Christian experience of non-duality, which deeply loves and respects both the utterly transcendent and utterly immanent, and realizes that these two are joined at the hip and are ceaselessly pouring into each other. And it's the pouring that's God. It's not one state or the other. It's the whole endless dynamism. And I think that's the unique contribution of Christianity when it conceives itself through a non-dual light. And that's what Thomas and Thomas Merton both get. And, this may be a strange speculation, but I keep coming back to it, that these are both Trappist monks, and that one of the things that Trappist monks do, as you know very well, is that every night, the last act of the day, is that they stand before the rose window of the Blessed Virgin and sing the Salve Regina and invoke the warm and tender energy of the Madonna into their life. And I've come to believe more and more strongly that softens the heart and creates a particular kind of tenderness to the Trappist understanding of spirituality. And when Thomas, in one of those last writings, and I don't have the book right before me, he tries to talk about what it's like to be in this bare presence. He says, you're awake, the experience beyond experience. You're awake. You don't know awake to what, but you know that it's infinitely tender and good and delicious. And two of the three words he uses in that quote come straight out of the Salve Regina. O dulce, o pie, o Jesu. It's like the thing has settled in, and this is this deep sweetness to Trappist contemplative non-duality foundations that I think is essentially Marian and definitely feminine in nature. And it's kind of interesting because the third party that we haven't mentioned yet in this trio, Bernadette Roberts, who again has broken a lot of new ground in Christian non-duality, but she never broke through to that tenderness in a kind of funny way. And so she tended to more and more say that God lives in the completely transcendent, and that she wanted to experience God as God is in God's self. Well, she said it as God is in himself. And she was not into gender. And she was frustrated because she could only experience God as he was in me. And so she kept trying to rip away the final scabs or veils of self so that she could find God only in the pure transcendent. Thomas and some of them somehow intuitively knew, Thomas Merton intuitively knew, you can't do it that way. Because part of who God is, and almost the most essential part of who God is God's deep willingness to manifest in form so that love can be full. And that's an essence, which I think I won't say is only fully represented in Christianity, but it certainly finds a beautiful setting for the jewel that it is in Christianity, with its incarnational impulse. And I think that this is what, when Christianity finally gets into the ballgame of non-duality, it's this aspect that's going to make it so sweet and so indispensable to the whole collective common wisdom of sacred wisdom, that you can't throw away the world as the Maya, the illusion, the veil. You have to take it as one of the inevitable and necessary poles of a manifestation of a third that embraces both of the poles and is itself changed by both of them. The Christians get this. And that's where Thomas was going at tremendous expense to his own final selfhood as he yielded more and more into the sacrament of powerlessness. And yet, in the bare absence, in that place where Thomas once was with his fretting entitlement, there was simply radiance.
There's this quote from your book coming to mind about this, where both Merton and Keating used true self frameworks. And one of the discoveries seems to be that, as you know, it's a shift towards a true self that lies in the exercise of transpersonal qualities as they manifest through one's own unique particularity. Ultimately, they are the aspect of the one true self, who is Christ, not a badge of personal identification, but our particular mode of participation in the one mystical body of Christ. And that's a stunning kind of expansion of true self, because I feel like so often it's translated as like, we each have our own very true self, and like, you have yours, I have mine, we'll get the false self of the way, and then I can see yours, you can see my true self. But to have one true self that's shining through our own particularity it leaves me a little speechless, with like not enough words to be able to talk about it. But you've synthesized it there about what that true self looks like in relationship as how one participates in the mystical body of Christ. And to me, that's a great, again, expansion of that framework of true self and false self, where we don't get caught in the definition of the words, but it's like, see that it's much more dynamic and needs to be much more integrated.
Yeah, it's really interesting that you bring that up, Paul, because Thomas's understanding of true self and false self were evolving consistently throughout his life. I mean, and it's one of the biggest things that separate his 1980s signature teaching from where he wound it up in 2018 to 40 years later. Because back then he was working in much more psychological modes, that your false self was your deformed, homemade, made up psyche. He says the false self is pathological. And so he was really working in the classic psychotherapeutic frameworks. In Middle Thomas, he began to see more and more our true self is that light of that one light of created humanity in relationship with God, shining through everybody's particularity, like light shining through a stained glass window.
Mm-hmm.
And it's a beautiful advance because it depersonalizes your true self and it gets us out of the damn rat race of my precious little individuality and the misinterpretation about the point of Jesus' teaching about the talents. But I think he moved beyond that even at the end in his very late. Too often that, well, you lose the emphasis on the container and only see the light. Oh, it's not really me. It's only the light of God shining through me and through everybody. And certainly this is a great improvement over it is me. But the funny thing is that it's both. It is the light of God and it's the little red piece of shrapnel in the stained glass window that's reflecting it are both real. And you take either one of them away and you don't get the thing anymore. So I think that he came back in a deep way to wonderful reconciliation with the fact that isness was not just in the transcendent, not just in the light, but in the whole thing that reflects it and mirrors it. And for him, by the end of his days, the false self became any fixed point of reference at all. So that whenever you stop and say, well, this is me perceiving it, he was basically beginning to get to the point, which is almost at the outer limit of what human beings can do, I think, where our self-reflexive consciousness is so set up to have a me on the inside, having an experience on the outside, monitoring that experience back to me, which then treasures it and reacts to it. And at the end, he was just saying, the deepest experience is no experience at all. He was basically, I would say that the false self was the self-reflective mechanism itself. And that when he says, and he takes it all the way back to God, like I will, there is only I am, then the I may drop out, leaving only the am. So that basically it's that self-reflexive property of consciousness that's going to trap everything in duality, ultimately. And Thomas got to a point where he could both see that and not get caught in that, which is really, really hard because it's hard to see that and still breathe and walk around on the planet. And yet, at the same time, forgive the robust Maya of everything. Here we are. It may be all illusion, but damn it, the daffodils are popping up through my garden. And the whole thing, from the formless, the very cut in the divine that makes I am, that turns to sheer monistic oneness into a dance, a rhythm, is ultimately the vehicle of love. So you're going to have to play the game, and to get rid of duality in all forms is to get rid of love. And so what I think Thomas knew in the end was it's like, how close can you go to that mainspring? How nearly can you touch that thing that once you touch it collapses the whole thing? And it was a dance in love with that place. And yet it didn't make him weird because his whole life had been built so long on the groundings that hold us like Christ in this body, because you don't have to know what all the givens of how the car works is to drive down the road. That's how it's wonderful to learn about what is this final point where you realize that everything is finally a convention, that set up a set of conditions that allow something else to happen. So rather than kicking over all the conventions and saying, okay, reality is what lies on the other side when there's no conventions left, you say, oh, isn't this amazing that reality allows itself to be infinitely subdivided and described? I love Richard Rohr's beautiful comment that to call something a mystery doesn't mean it's undescribable. It means it's infinitely describable. And I Thomas just really got that in his heart. It took most of his 95 years to really get to that place. But I think by the time he left the planet, he was there so strongly and so powerfully. He had, like Christ, reconciled his divine and his human nature. I could live as one in that small sliver where they overlap.
It's such a marvelous book, and I think that's one of the big takeaways for me as you're talking about any reference point being suspect, because it takes the dynamic flow of God and stultifies it and puts it in like a container, and then I had this great experience rather than allow that to be just washed away with the river. One of my favorite poets has a line about, in a life well lived, you're a river. Like, you're always flowing. And I just think that is part of where frameworks get stuck, when they just lead to these static building blocks. And I think that was one of the things that I've experienced in this book, is the constant waterways crossing each other. And like, there was never a place that you just stop and you just rest and you bask in your contemplative wisdom that you've just understood this. But it's just that constant receiving and surrendering. It is that willingness to let go in that kenosis of the everyday, while not losing the concrete of like, I got 2 kids to raise. I have a wife that I love. Like, this is the real deal here.
This is a real deal. This is good. This is good. But it's funny, Paul, because in our process of kind of commodifying and commercializing contemplation that so much of the spiritual industry has been about, we've turned it back into the very thing that's anti-flow.
Yes.
And even Thomas Keating in his early days, with all these neat little tiny schematics of the, true self, the false self, this is what happens, you sit in your meditation, you unload. It all sort of slowed it down and turned it into little tinker toys rather than this river. And his own life journey, I think, in the past 30 years, or after he gave us his signature teaching, has certainly contributed beautifully to exploring the river and reminding people that while it's very, very useful pedagogically to create a structure when you're learning something, that at some point you have to get off the structure, because the structure is not the reality. And if you want to spend your whole life climbing on the jungle gym of contemplation, have at it. But it's the jungle gym, baby. and so you don't have to disavow. It's just that we continue to do things that reinforce the small self that always reifies that way. Write in your journal all about your experience of God. Let's have sharing where you emote endlessly about your experience of God. We aren't really training people how to get on with it beyond that. So we're sort of romanticizing the personal experience with God collectively shared as contemplation, which it isn't. But, Paul, for me, one of the most gratifying things that has happened in the wake of the publication of the book is that people, I've noticed in contemplative outreach and elsewhere, are actually confidently beginning to engage with some of these teachings. A little bit more confident that, as wild as they seem, they're not that off the charts, that they've already been prepared. You just need somebody to say, yeah, the water's fine, just jump in. And I swear that I'm already seeing a beautiful difference. The last publication of the Contemplative Outreach newsletter was simply stunning in the honesty with which there were articles about applying the practice in deep situations of self-encounter, in prison work, and in a world torn apart, that revealed to me a quantum level shift in the ability to interiorize this teaching and move out from it with a much calmer center, and less of a sense that the way you hold on to Thomas Keating is look back at where he was, and more of a sense that you continue to partner with him as we all walk into a world which is really demanding of contemplatives. Things that better for better or worse, we're the ones who are going to have to step up to the plate and start providing him. Our teaching has prepared us for this. It hasn't taken us all the way, but at least gets it in the gate. And we're going to have to work out of more detachment, more impartiality, more deep surrendered trust than our world is able to muster at this point. And so there are real roots there for regrouping and getting a wind and operating out of a genuinely mature, non-dual Christianity, mature and maturing. I had a feeling when I was working with Thomas and when he was pushing me so hard to get this book, that this was a hump that he felt needed to get over, and that my contribution would be just a little bit of a kind of jumpstart to the hump. And it had to be done, and I was happy to follow him with it. But that once that hump was gotten over, that he himself and the collective kind of whatever it is that sparks something and allows it to take its own natural shape in a larger atmosphere would kick in. And I've got my fingers crossed that that's happening, and that we're going to see across the board a growing up and an emergence, I guess in the language which is more popular in Contempla or in CIC, out of green levels of consciousness into a genuine teal and what lies beyond it. A genuine, deeply rooted impartiality, an understanding that compassion is a post, not an experience, and a sobriety about what a human being is called to do in the world for the tiny bit of time that we live as an individual pixel of consciousness. And yet a sense that this thing is grounded in something so much deeper, that our contemplative silence, kenosis, surrender, and not being freaked out when we can't control something, all of those trainings are very, very good to begin to touch deeper into the well springs of what's really got to flow into this planet if we're going to not just sort of blow our turn at the helm.
Amen. May it be so, because it's the image that I had reading this book, as you talked about like a jump start, was, I don't know if this still works on newer cars, but on older cars, when the starter was kind of going out, you could take a hammer and hit it, and it would provide the spark to start the engine. And that's kind of what it feels like with this book, is like, there's a spark that's like all of a sudden giving it new life to kind of go further. And I appreciate that invitation for that furthering of that work with that impartiality. And one thing I appreciate about how you're holding this post is the way that you're looking, like being at the Garrison Institute with you a month ago, you're looking to these younger leaders, like, go and do likewise and experiment and try. And like, this is not an endpoint. This is a beginning. And keep taking that hammer and hitting that starter, because there's a lot more life in it. And that's just exciting. That's the thrillingness of this journey to me.
Yeah, it's so true. And the neat thing about third generation is that most of third generation doesn't remember the teacher alive. And so it gives the third generation a freedom that you don't have in the second generation. The second generation is still tied to the memory of the living teacher. The third generation is fresher and more independent. And so in the younger people, and I've watched some of them growing and finding their voices, some of them were shaped by Thomas a little, but they didn't have to do 40 years with him. I mean, when you talk about like people like Adam Bucko and Rory McKenty there, they've got it in their own hearts and minds and souls. And I think this is the way it naturally wants to flow. Thomas never wanted it to get involved in personalities. I certainly don't. That these are all tiny bits of service to the unfolding of that divine arc toward consciousness. And we look at where we are in our generation and we give it the best shot we can. And it seems to me that things are unfolding rightly. And I'd have to say that you're one of the people that I most respect in the whole contemplative journey for having a clear and discerning heart. And to see that you've caught so close to what are my own deepest hopes and dreams and senses of obligation in this book is tremendously heartwarming and encouraging.
Well, thank you. I'm so glad to hear that. And I hope that others, as they read this, catch that as well. Because I think it has so much work to do yet in the world. And I believe it will do so. Cynthia, I always close out my conversation by asking, and this is to keep it in the body, if you were going to pair our conversation with a drink, what would be your drink of choice and why?
With a drink?
Yeah.
Okay, well, on this cold, clammy late spring day in Maine, how about some St. Brendan's cream liqueur?
I love it. What an image. What an image. St. Brendan's cream liqueur.
Well, St. Brendan never took it along on his voyage to the New Worlds, but yeah, it's mellow, it's strong, it's blended, it's heartwarming.
Gosh, thank you so much, Cynthia. Thank you for listening to this episode of Contemplify. May it stir conversation with kindred spirits and strangers alike, and provide a nourishing morsel of thought for your week. Slip over to contemplify.com to find the show notes for this episode. While you're there, sign up for the monthly Contemplify non-required reading list and the weekly contemplative practice, Lo-Fi and Hushed. If you're enjoying Contemplify, rate and review it on your podcast player. The president of the internet slipped me a note just the other day on a napkin that said, "This will help spread the contemplative cheer." The theme song of Contemplify is called Langside by Charles Enns and Darren Hovius. Fellas, grateful as always. And I'm looking forward to bringing you more musings and conversations with contemplatives in the world here in the near future. Until then, be well.